Hey class, I wanted to talk to you a little bit this week about writing a thesis statement, about refreshing your ideas about writing a thesis statement. You guys will probably remember doing it in Composition 1 and or in high school, but hopefully we can review it a little bit and make some more sense with the thesis statement. Um, I know we talked about this a little bit, but oftentimes people think that a thesis statement's a question that you're asking in your paper, but that's usually not the case. It is usually an answer to a question, because the thesis statement it's an answer to a question, but it also charts the course for your entire paper. So when the audience gets to that statement, they should be able to think to themselves, oh, this is what the paper is going to be about. And then if the paper is about that stuff, you've met their expectations, and if it's not about what it seemed you were going to talk about in your thesis statement, it puts off your audience. And you don't really want that to happen. You want to be forthcoming with your audience as much as you can. The thesis statement, almost all writing has a thesis statement, even fiction, even if you're reading a novel, reading a story, there's usually some place in the story where you more clearly see a phrase or an idea of what the entire story is about. And especially if the author who wrote it, they should have an idea of what the entire story is about. So yeah, everywhere you will see that. It's when you hit it, it's charting the course. It is leading and guiding the audience when they're reading it forward. And that's one thing you really want to do when you're writing anything. You want to guide your audience. You want to be clear with them. You want to show them where you're going and be forthcoming with all of that. So with that said, I want to check out a reading by Stephen Wilhoit, and he talks about a few different types of thesis statements. So let's check it out. So you can have a positive thesis statement, and let's look at this open one. So Jones presents a clear, convincing argument in favor of increased funding for the school district. So you can tell that if you're reading a paper, this sounds like a newspaper article. It sounds like the topic is about Jones' presentation. Someone else is writing about it. You get the impression that they're positive about it, but this is also an open thesis because we don't know exactly why they're positive about the presentation. So we get an idea that the paper is going to be about the convincing arguments he made, but we don't know what those are. So it's still positive, but it's open in that we don't know exactly what they're going to talk about. This one is closed, and the more formal your writing is, the more closed you want your thesis statement to be. So in this one, through his use of precise examples and his accessible style, Jones presents a clear and convincing argument in favor of increased funding for the school district. So again, they're reviewing this presentation. They're positive about it, but this time it's closed. They close it by telling us exactly why they're positive about it. So we expect the rest of this paper to be about his use of precise examples and his accessible style. So in the rest of whatever this essay, this paper, this article is, that they're going to talk about these two things. And if they don't talk about those things, then we feel as the audience that they really misled us. But you don't always have to be positive about what you're writing. It can be negative too. So here's an open negative thesis statement. Jones' argument in favor of increased funding is not convincing. So you can see that they don't like it, so it's negative, but it's also open because we don't really get a sense of why it's not convincing to them. We expect in the rest of the paper that they're going to tell it to us, but they're not very clear about what that is. And again, in informal writing, you can do that. And in this first essay we're doing, it's pretty informal. You do need to have a thesis statement. It can be open, but you always want to work towards a closed thesis statement. In the two essays after our first one, you're going to work towards having a closed thesis statement. So here's a negative closed one. Due to numerous lapses in reasoning and problems with the organization, Jones' argument in favor of increased funding is not convincing. So they're still negative. It wasn't convincing to them. And it was due to numerous lapses in reasoning and problems with the organization. So you expect the paper to be about these two things. They're going to go through what the problems with the organization was and how that wasn't convincing. And they're going to go through the lapses in his reasoning and tell us why that made his presentation not convincing. But it is nice moving from, so you have the positive, you have a negative, but you can also have a mixed thesis, which is really kind of nice and sometimes hard to do, because a lot of things in life, you're not 100% against it, you're not 100% for it, but you have mixed feelings about it. So you can like part of something and not like part of something else, but you have to be clear with your audience about what those are. So you can have a mixed thesis. Particularly with the readings that we're looking at, you could like something that someone said, but not like his overall idea, or something like that. So here's an open one. Although uneven in its presentation, Jones' argument in favor of increased funding for the school district is ultimately convincing. So it's convincing, but they didn't like some stuff about it. But again, it's open in that they're not very clear about what those things are. For the closed one, even though there are some problems with the organization Jones employs in his report, his use of expert testimony makes his argument for increased funding to the schools convincing. So here I expect they closed it by being more exact about what they're going to talk about, and I expect the paper to then be about these problems with his organization, but how his use of expert testimony makes his argument convincing. And they're going to show the audience these things. And if they didn't, we would feel deceived as part of the audience.